Hi out there, and welcome to the Revere Veterans and Community Show. Today we have two special guests and two great guests. And I would like to introduce, first of all, Tom Kelley, a Medal of Honor recipient and a captain in the Navy, and Mrs. Joan Kelley, welcome.
Thank you.
A lieutenant commander from the Navy. So, Tom, before we start, I'd just like to have your wife just to spend a couple of minutes and tell her about yourself.
Well, it's actually a commander. I was a commander in the Naval Reserve, and I served from 1979 to 1999. And I was a public affairs officer, so I got to write press releases and go to parties. And during that period of time, it was pretty much the Cold War, and so I was very lucky that I was not deployed anyplace. And I had an opportunity to meet people from all over the United States whom I never would have met if I hadn't been in the reserves, and also people of different countries, and I got to work with people from different countries as well. And so I love the idea of working together as a team to accomplish a mission, and it was just a wonderful thing that I did, and I'm very happy for my experience.
Thank you, Joan, and I salute you for your service. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And you, Mr. Tom, that's what you like for you to call
Yeah,
you,
sure, Tom.
Okay. Can you tell us a little about yourself, how you got into, when you first got into the service, sir?
Well, I was born in Boston and had a very happy childhood. Went to public schools in Boston, and then to Boston College High School and College of the Holy Cross up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and graduated in 1960. And when I got out of high school, I really wanted to go into one of the naval programs, whether the Naval Academy or ROTC or something like that, but my eyesight was pretty bad, 2200, and you had to have perfect eyesight in order to get into those programs, so I wasn't able to get in. But towards the end of my college days, I learned of a program called Officer Candidate School for the Navy, where you can go, the vision restrictions are a little more generous. So I signed up for that, and I was accepted, and went to Officer Candidate School in Newport for 16 weeks, and became a naval officer in 1960.
Oh, you were a pilot?
No, I spent all my time on surface ships, things like destroyers and things like that.
Could you tell us how you received the recipient? Oh, you met President Nixon. Could you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I received the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House in 1970, and there were about 12 or 13 of us receiving it at the same time. This is back during the days of Vietnam, of course. And so we were in a big room in the White House, and President Nixon went to each one of us and shook our hand and hung the medal around our neck, and you know, had a little conversation. And in my case, my conversation consisted of, he asked me where I was from, and I said, Boston, sir. And he said, oh, do you eat baked beans every night? And I said, no, sir, only on Saturday. And he said, and he walked on to the next guy. So that was my total conversation with President Nixon.
How did you feel meeting him? I mean,
oh, it's kind of awesome, really. You don't find yourself in the White House every day, and of course I had never met a president before. Earlier I had met a man who would become president, but that's another story. But it was kind of exciting, and being around fellow soldiers and sailors and Marines was nice also to see them recognized.
Right. Tom, I'd like to ask you a question, and I hope you don't feel embarrassed, because, you know, you are a hero to me, a real hero. Could you tell us about that incident, about your boat, that you put your boat out in front of all the other boats to save your troops?
Well, I had been in the Navy about 8 years and volunteered to go to Vietnam. And I ended up in an outfit called the Mobile Riverine Force, and it's an Army-Navy operation where the Navy had boats about 50 or 60 feet long, and they were capable of carrying Army troops on operations down in the Mekong Delta, the southern part of Vietnam, which is a lot of rivers and canals and things like that. So I was responsible for a division of boats, which was about 250 men and about 25 boats. On this particular day, we were on an operation with about 8 boats. I was in charge of the operation, and we were carrying an Army company of Army soldiers from the 9th Infantry Division to, we would take them to the shore of these canals. They would get off and move inland and look for enemy soldiers, and then we'd pick them back up and go to another location. And on this particular day, we were backloading the troops onto the boats, and the troops were all on board. We're ready to get underway and go back to another location. And one of the boats couldn't get their ramp up. These boats had a ramp that went down, and the troops would walk off and walk back on. Big, heavy, like 20-ton ramp. And normally it was hoisted up by hydraulics, but there was a casualty and they couldn't do it. So they had to do it by hand, which took a long time, and we knew it was going to take a long time. So, and the boat, meanwhile, was sitting there, kind of literally a sitting duck on the beach, because they had no protection. So I formed the rest of the boats in a kind of a cordon around the boat, and stayed out there and put my boat right where the enemy fire was going to come from, which it did. They opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, rockets, mortars, small arms, you name it. And so a big firefight ensued, and one of the rocket-propelled grenades came in and detonated right near my head, and I forgot to duck, so I got hit, and I fell down a chute, about 10-foot chute down in the boat, holding on a couple of radio handsets, and I was able to keep talking to the troops and directing the fight until we were able to stop the enemy attack and got the troops on board the boat. The boat got fixed, and we were able to get out of there. And meanwhile, a Navy medic, a Navy corpsman, jumped aboard my boat and administered to me, and he saved my life, basically. He stabilized my condition, so I was able to continue what I was doing and get out of there, and a helicopter came along and medevacked me out of there.
Good, I'm glad, because you're still here. Thank
Yeah,
God for that.
I'm glad too.
I'd like to get back to you, Mrs. Joan.
Yes.
You mentioned the Cold War. I guess you mean about the Russians when you say the Cold War, because that's who we always have the Cold War with.
The Soviet Union, yes.
Right, I call them the Russians, but it's the Soviet Union, you're correct. When I was in Berlin in 1948, the Russians put on a blockade. When Kennedy was president, they put on the missile crisis with Cuba. With you, it was with them, the Cold War. Now we got Putin, who never goes along with us, especially with the war that we have with Syria. These were our allies during the war, but during your time, tell us how it was with them, with the Soviet Union at the time you were in the service.
Well, it was, the era of a lot of propaganda, and what we did was, as public affairs people, journalists and photographers, we just tried to show, what the Navy did, the Navy's mission, and how important it was for the Navy to be as big as it was, because, of course, nowadays the Navy's a lot smaller. At the time I served, there was a lot of talk about having a 600-ship Navy. And now it's much smaller than that, and there's even people that are even questioning whether we need this big Navy we have now. But in those days, the Russians were trying to control the open waters, the blue water Navy they called it, and so there was always a presence of Soviet submarines every place, probably even in our domestic waters, and it was always kind of a cat and mouse game of where they could be and whether we could catch them and how soon we could catch them, and whether they would ever really harm us or not. And we always felt that, of course, the danger was there, was imminent, that because they had free reign of the oceans and the seas around the world, and they could approach the coastline of any nation, that they may have had the upper hand many times, and it was a scary time. I mean, now we look back on it, and we're sort of nostalgic for the Cold War, and the spy stories that came out of the Cold War, are still very interesting. But and it looks like it was, oh well, the Russians didn't really mean it, and then of course it turned out that they didn't have the money to maintain such a large Navy. But at the time, it was very real, and it was very scary.
I know, because I remember President Reagan, when he went to Berlin, and he said to the Berliner, for them to tear down that wall. Gorbachev, I believe, was the president, and they finally did tear down a wall. You was in the 70s as commander in the Navy. And, I mean, during that time in the 70s. We had problems with them in the Middle East, too, because we were siding with one side, they were siding with the opposite side. It always seemed to go that way.
Well, and it's that way today with Syria.
Right, exactly.
We're on different sides of the situation, but there seems to be consensus that the Syrians need to get rid of their chemical weapons, and it's good to see the two powers working together on that.
That's good, too. Tom, I'd like to get back to you, if I may, sir. You were also in charge of veteran affairs at the State House in the Commonwealth. Tell us how you first got involved in that, and then...
Well, almost by accident. I hadn't lived in Massachusetts since 1960 when I joined the Navy, and I was living down in Washington, D.C. at the time after I got out of the Navy, and a friend of mine was the Commissioner of Veteran Services for Massachusetts, a gentleman named Tom Hudner, who was another...
Excuse me, is that the same Tom Hudner who's also a Medal of Honor recipient?
Yes, he's a Medal of Honor recipient. He lives out in Concord, Mass. And he was a naval aviator in the Korean War.
Right.
And he received his medal because during the Korean War up around the Chosin Reservoir, he and his wingman were flying around up there, and his wingman got shot down. His wingman happened to be Ensign Jesse Brown, who was the first African-American naval aviator in history. And so Hudner crashed his own plane next to where Jesse was shot down, trying to save him. But Jesse had been trapped in the plane, and the plane was on fire, and the fuselage was all crumpled around him. So Tom Hudner could not get him out, although this was a 35-degree below temperature, snow, 6 feet of snow, packing snow around to try to put the fire out. He couldn't do it. So they had to leave Jesse behind. A helicopter came and took Captain Tom Hudner away. And anyway, fast forward many years, he was the Commissioner of Veteran Services for Massachusetts, and I wanted to come back home. I'd been away from home for a long time, and I called him and said, hey, any chance you can help me get a job up there? And he said, well, I may have an opening on my staff. And to make a long story short, he did have an opening, and he hired me. And several months later, he decided to retire. And Governor Cellucci, whom I didn't know or I had never done anything for him, never gave him any money, I didn't even know who he was, appointed me to be the Commissioner of Veteran Services. And that's when I went aboard, and that's where I first met Joan, who happened to be on the staff there at the time. So I had the position for about 12 years, and then about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, I retired.
And I got to say, you did an excellent job, and I want to thank you for what you did for all the veterans, including
well, thank
yours
you.
truly.
I'd like to put a plug in right now for
Please do.
The people in Revere are very, very fortunate to have as their Veteran Service Officer, Veterans Agent, a fellow named Phil Bua.
Nick Bua.
Nick Bua, who is one of the best. He's passionate about taking care of veterans. Very hard-working guy. He knows all the rules and regulations. He knows how to bend them to get things done also. So Nick is a superstar, and I think the folks in Revere are very, very fortunate to have him.
I agree with you. We're lucky to have him, too, and I like to call him the Commissioner.
Call him whatever you want.
You mentioned something about Tom Hudner going down to save that African-American pilot. We had an African-American Tuskegee Airman up here.
Oh.
Maybe you know him, Woody Woodhouse?
Oh, I know Woody, yeah.
Right, and he told us some stories that were sad. But before I do that, I would like to ask you how it was with you when you were in the Navy as captain, how the African-Americans were treated. Now, when I was in the service, zero. We had none in our outfit, zero. So,
well, when I joined the Navy in 1960, there were very, very few African-American sailors. I don't think there were any, very few African-American officers, but the African-Americans I knew were mainly cooking food, serving food, doing laundry aboard ships. The ratings like machinist mate or gunner's mate or torpedo man or whatever were basically closed to African Americans at that time. And the same for women. The only women I ever knew in the Navy at that time were maybe if you go to the clinic, there's a nurse there, or if you go to the admin office on the shore there was a typist or two or something like that. But things have really come along in the last, well, in my case, 50 odd years since I joined the Navy. And now the women are certainly have every opportunity to do what the men are doing, and they're doing a magnificent job. And you know, race, as far as African Americans is concerned, it's in my opinion, it's not an issue at all anymore. And I think the services, particularly the Army, really led the way to integration in the United States and in accepting African Americans and helping them achieve their full potential.
Right, but you know, when Woody Woodhouse was here, he told me a story that I found it hard to believe, that they had flown a mission, and they were coming back from Germany, Tom, and they got in at 3 o'clock in the morning, and their canteen or mess hall was closed, or the PX, but the offices was open and they were thirsty. So all they wanted was a drink of water, like we're doing right here. They wouldn't let them go into the officers' mess to get a drink of water. Well, these pilots that came back said, we're going. And they went in, and they all got court-martialed.
No.
Some of them even got a dishonorable discharge.
And these were Tuskegee Airmen, huh?
Exactly. But it was Ronald Reagan, the president, who overturned all that and rectified the whole situation.
It was Harry Truman in 1948.
Was he the one that started that?
In 1948, he overturned it, and it took a while for the men and women in uniform to accept the new regulations, but eventually, over time, they have, and it's not much of an issue anymore.
Right. I found it very easy when I was in the service. Like we had the Army women there, but they were usually secretaries, typing, doing the typing, and they were officers, and I would salute them. I had no problem with that, but yes, some of my outfit saluted because they had to, or they would be disciplined, but they weren't too happy about it. How did you find it when you were in the service, Joan, amongst the men?
Well, I found that I was pretty much respected, and you know, because of I was respected because of my rank, and there weren't that many women. It's true, it was unusual to have women on ships. In fact, women weren't allowed on certain types of ships. They weren't allowed on combatant ships until just recently, where now women are actually allowed to command combatant ships. I think there's still a prohibition on women on submarines or certain classes of submarines, but it's nice to see all of the various jobs open to women. I was doing public affairs, and there were a lot of women in the public affairs field, so I mean, we were still a minority in the service. We were, you know, under maybe 15%, but there were women in those fields. But it was unusual to see, when I served, for women to be in combatant roles, and I was working with an active duty lieutenant once, a female, and somebody saluted her and said, "Oh, we better salute the nurses," and she looked at her shoulder boards, which had the insignia of a line officer, regular line officer, not the insignia of a nurse, and she said, "Well, I don't see any nurses here. What are you talking about?" You know, just a kind of a gentle reminder that that she was a line officer too, and she wasn't just, you know, categorized as a nurse or an administrative officer, which many were, in going back through the years. So all in all, I was given an opportunity to advance and to become a commander, which is senior rank in the beginning of the senior ranks in the Navy, and so I feel very good about my experience and very fortunate.
Tom, can I ask you, how old you were when you first got into the service? Because you must have been awful young.
No, I was 21.
That's awful young.
Yeah, well, I just graduated from college.
Which college did you go to, by the way?
Holy Cross up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and so I was 21.
21? I was, well, I finished high school. My parents wanted me to go to college, but was cooped up in the Big Apple, and I wanted to see something else beside the Big Apple. And I figured the Army was the best bet for me, and it was. And I got in at 17. And they sent me out to Germany. The minute they found out I could speak a little foreign language, which is a lot better than the English I speak, and they booked me and just threw me out there.
Well, you went to the College of Hard Knocks, I guess, huh?
Yeah, but I tell you, the best years of my life were in the service.
I think most people feel that the years they were in the service were the highlight of their lives. And
to me, I think about it to this very day. I remember working with the DPs, with the prisoners of war, with the war criminals that were over there at the time, and it brings back a lot of sad memories to me, too.
Well, this last weekend, not this past weekend, the weekend before, we went to a Navy reunion from a ship that I had served on back in 1964 to 66, and I hadn't seen most of these people for 40 or more years, and we got together, and it was like we just saw each other yesterday, and telling old sea stories and things like that. So great bonds are formed.
Right. By the way, what are your future plans, Joan, if I may ask you? What would you like to see for the service of the future or for yourself?
I would like to see everybody have to do some kind of national service. It could be military service, it could be the Peace Corps, it could be helping with the environment, or
community service, right?
Community service. I think it's really important for young people to understand that their living here is a privilege, and that they need to give something back. And it's also a great leveler, the military, as you know, and as I was saying earlier about meeting people from all over the country, all over the world, you realize that you're not so very different from other people, or you realize there maybe are regional differences, but you all have a common goal and a common mission. And I think if young people had national service required of them, that they would experience that leveling, you know, in society, and realize how much can be accomplished when people work towards the same goal.
Not only that, would it make those people love their country a lot more than when I look around today and I see just the opposite of what you just said, because none of them have any disciplinary action about our great country on there.
Well, they take our freedoms for granted.
Right. Now, when I went to school, and I'm talking about elementary public school when I was 11, 12, we had to wear a white shirt, a blue tie, clean pants every Wednesday to be patriotic, and everybody had to wear the same thing, and we enjoyed it, and we were very patriotic. Even during the war, I got to tell you this, Tom, they came around to my school, and I hadn't graduated from public school. I was 13 at the time. And the boys were off during the war. The farmers' boys, the helpers, were out fighting in World War II. They wanted us kids to go work on the farm, to get up and take their place. And I did. I went to work on a farm outside of Rutland, Vermont, called Ira, near Lake Mamassine. I would get up at 4:30 every day, go out and bring the cows in, milk them, do the hay. And to me, that was discipline with the farmer, because he made sure that I got up at 4:30 and did my chores. And that's the way I learned how to take orders. I know a lot of people out there don't think I take orders, but I do.
Well, World War II was an all-hands effort, full court press, and everybody was involved. You were involved as a 13-year-old kid. Nowadays, it's not like that. Less than 1% of the American population is actually serving in the military, and most families have no connection with the men and women serving right now.
Well, Tom, today the military is strictly volunteer. It's
volunteer.
Not draft. See, we should keep I would like to see the draft come back. I mean, not in the sense that, so the boys would learn, the kids, because we have a lot of people on drugs. We have a lot of people, robberies and things like that. You see it in the papers all over the country. But if they could serve their country maybe for 1 year military service and the other 1 year community service, it would be good for the whole country. It'd be good for them.
Well, if there were a draft in existence now, then the wars we're in right now in Iraq and Afghanistan would have been over 10 years ago, probably.
Right.
If there were a draft.
Now, Tom, I hope I don't put you on the spot with this, but I got to ask you this question. I have a lot of discussions. You hear, like, they have, when you bomb somebody today, if there's civilian casualties, you get in trouble. During World War II, we didn't worry about civilian casualties. Otherwise, we'd still be fighting Germany today, because we bombed the factories, if there were civilians there, they got killed. If there were houses built around the factory for the people that worked there, they got killed in there. I don't see how we could win any war, Tom, the way we fight it's called a limited war, actually. You can run into a house with a bunch of civilians and you'd be shooting at me and I cannot shoot back at you. I mean, our hands are literally tied.
Well, that's what they have. We're supposed to be a cut above the other nations, and we're supposed to respect human life. And I think they're doing a pretty good job of limiting the amount of harm to civilians. But accidents will happen, and I tend to disagree with you. I think
That's okay.
We shouldn't be killing innocent civilians.
But this is what we had to do during World War II.
Different.
Because
bombing cities.
look what the Nazis were doing. They were killing innocent civilians, taking people, gypsies, Jews, anybody, putting them in concentration camps and gassing them.
Of course.
We had no choice in those days, Tom.
But they were a nation, just like Japan was a nation. Now we're not fighting a nation. We're fighting
a gang?
terror movements or gangs exactly around the world. And they don't owe their allegiance to any country. It's a lot different now, isn't it?
I'm inclined to agree with you.
When you have to wonder about the use of drones, and that whole issue is coming to light right now, and it's a good one to have spotlight on, and we should ask the questions and answer
Joan.
the questions.
And they want to bring them before a tribunal for the ones that piloted the drones for killing the innocent civilians. But I didn't hear him say about bringing the other enemy out there who's killing innocent civilians to the same tribunal that they want to bring the Americans to.
Well, I mean, when you put technology in the place of where a person would be making a decision, then I think you have to ask these questions. Is it appropriate, and what's the difference between casualties, civilian casualties that happen as a consequence of war, which is what you're talking about, versus when it goes too far and too many innocent civilians are killed indiscriminately. And I think those are questions that, as a society and a democracy, we need to have a healthy debate about that.
I know. People don't realize until they're actually combat. I might even myself have a moral conflict if I had to shoot someone. And especially at the end of the war in Germany, it was 14 years old and 12 years old and 9 years old that were holding the guns.
Oh, sure. Just like in Vietnam, same thing.
Same thing? Right. So, by the way, I want to thank both of you for coming up here. And it was an honor to have you, Joan.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you.
It was an honor to have you, Tom.
Thank you very
a Medal
much,
of Honor
Morris.
recipient.
Thank you, Morris.
And may God bless you both, and may God bless our troops, people of Revere, and the great country, the United States of America. And Tom, on our 100th show, it's going to be you.
Fantastic.
Thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much, Morris. Thank you.
And I salute you too, Joan.
Thank you, Morris. I salute you as well.
It was an honor for me, really, to have you. And this is the 100th show at the Revere TVA studio. And on the 100th show, I really have a special guest. He's a World War II veteran from fought in the Pacific. His name is Tom Hill. Tom, first let me salute you.
Thank you, Morris.
For coming, for your service.
Thank you, Morris.
Thank you for coming.
Too.
Thank you for coming, Tom. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you. And let me tell you, you are full of history. You are full of history. So let's start off first. You like to talk about the starting of the American Legion. So give us a history lesson on that.
Well, when I was discharged from the service, there was 4 organizations. There was the AMVETS, the DAV, strictly American organizations, and there was the VFW, and they operated on longitude and latitude. In other words, you had to be outside the limits of the United States to be eligible to become a member. The Legion was formed in France by a group of members, officers, enlisted men, and that when they came back, just before they came back, they had a setup of how they had, and was just a handful of men, and one of the leaders was named Doyle, and he came out of Malden, Mass, and he was a real power of the American Legion, and that he was maybe one of the top 3. Now, the Revere American Legion, first national organization of the American Legion, is 2,400,000 members today. They were 3 million at one time, and today the Revere Post at one time had 1,550 members, and they're down to around 200. The National Convention of the American Legion, when they got together, they had sections of the country that they had grouped together, and that the New England was grouped in with New York and New Jersey, and that they would be guaranteed a commander like once every 16 years. In that time that the thing that they set it up like the United States Senate, I had the opportunity to go to National in 1955 to the national headquarters of the American Legion in Indianapolis. I stayed at the Antlers Hotel, which was owned by the Elks and then sold to the American Legion. And across the street from the American Legion was the 40 and 8 group. And the 40 and 8 group was the fun-loving group of the American Legion. They would have a parade. Their work was charity, and they had fire engines. They had mock trains and so on and that type.
Tom, can I ask you, if
Sure.
I may, who was the first commander of the American Legion in Revere?
Otis Prey, I believe.
And do you know what year that was, roughly?
I would say it had to be about 1918, somewhere in there.
Oh, right after the First War.
Yeah, and that the Legion locally also had a club within a club which was illegal, and they called it the Last Man's Club.
Why was it illegal?
Because you can't have an organization within an organization. That's under the laws of Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
And they had 25 members, and they would meet the night before Memorial Day, and they had a bottle of wine, and they would review what happened during the past year and who died. And the bottle of wine was kept in the safe, and the last man standing would drink from the bottle of wine in memory of his fellow comrades. And that was called the Last Man's Club. Chief McCarrick was a member of it. He was a fire chief. The Carl Linstone, superintendent of schools, was a member. And there were prominent people in the city that had this club.
Right, Tom, and I would like to interject something, if I may. You were a veteran of the Pacific, too, correct?
Yes, I was.
The Doolittle Raiders, I think there was 74 or 75 of those Doolittle Raiders, if my memory is correct.
The Doolittle Raiders, I've heard two figures. One was 6 planes with escorts, and another was 20. And they dropped the bombs in Tokyo Center, apparently. And Tokyo Center, I've been there, and that the Ginza is like Times Square, New York, and off to the left about a half a block was the Imperial Palace where the Emperor lived and all that. That's where they dropped the bombs, and that's where the Japanese had to keep reserve soldiers to protect the Emperor and the Ginza, their Times Square.
The reason I brought that up is when you mentioned about the Legion, they had the glasses of wine, and as the people died, of course, it went down.
Yes.
Same thing with the Doolittle Raiders, if I may ask you. They used to have a glass of wine, and anytime someone passed away, they would turn the cup upside down.
Probably, yes.
Yep, and that's almost similar to what you were mentioning about.
That was quite a thing in the Revere Post. And that, but
Well,
anyway.
Tom, before we go on further, I got to apologize to you. You are 91 years old.
That's
God
correct.
bless you. I should say 91 years young.
Yeah.
Right. You're also a U.S. Army veteran.
Air Corps, yeah.
U.S. Army Air Corps veteran.
Right.
But you are so full of history. My God. I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, even at your age, I can hardly remember where I live sometimes.
I forget now what I had for breakfast. But anyway, getting back to
Go ahead.
Indianapolis, they met twice a year, and they would meet the first week in May and sometime around Thanksgiving. The first week in May, was the week of the Kentucky Derby. so that they would have 2 seats like the United States Senate, and that the National Executive Committee men and the state commander from each state would sit there and they would review what their objectives were and what they did. There also was a room to the left, and the room to the left was advisors to the national commander. And that the advisors to the national commander were that they would review everything that he said, they would tell him what to say, and that no single utterance that he would make would affect their programs or goals of the American Legion. They never had a national contest for national commander. And the reason for that is they believed it would divide the organization. This was when they set up the organization. So you would have 5 district vice commanders, and they would make their campaign known to the delegates of the various states, and they would come in and they would address your caucus and say, I'm a candidate for a national commander, and this is my program. The next day they would withdraw. Now the vice commanders, whoever was going to be a candidate, he would come from, say, New England, New Jersey, New York, and he would do his advertising. He would come address the caucus to see if he could get any support out of the caucus, and if he couldn't, he would withdraw the next day, and the next year the candidate from this group would again present his credentials. And every 16 years, I believe, the New England, New York, New Jersey area would have a national commander. Last year, the national commander came from Hawaii. This year, he comes from Alaska. So apparently, it works well in what they have.
We have a state commander, I believe, that comes from our own city.
Comes from the city of Revere, Revere Post number 61.
Right here where I belong
right
to.
Here, and I belong here too. And I belonged here since 1945. I think it's 67 years, 68 years.
Right.
And I think I'm the oldest member.
I think you are.
Right there now. So.
And we have a terrific commander. I believe his name is Bill Chisholm.
Yes.
Could you
He's
tell
the
us
state commander.
Yep.
And that he's done a great job, and that...
Yep, he did a great job when he was with the American Legion.
Yes, he did. He has. The other thing, we were very fortunate, like the VFW, Joe Hankin and Bessie Hankin. Joe Hankin was a national vice commander of the VFW. Bessie Hankin was president of the auxiliary. Joe Hankin didn't run for senior vice commander. He was junior vice. And Bessie went all the way and became national president. She remained active and ran the parade part of the convention for many years for the VFW. Anybody that called Bessie Hankin or Joe Hankin, whether it was statewide or not, got an answer and got results. They active. Revere was very fortunate. We had some good Legionnaires here. We had Bud Sullivan, we had Henry Brown, and that in my time here, we ran a convention in 1955, and I was the head of the organization, and that I had 6 people that would go with me. We traveled the state, and that they helped us with our convention effort. They helped us with the parade. They sent bugle and drum corps and whatever they could to help us. What else can I say about it?
Okay, Tommy, I got to ask you this question. Besides, the American Legion, I don't remember this. There was also a VFW. We have one on Beachmont, but there was also one, I believe, on Shirley Avenue at one time.
That was the originator, VFW 940.
That's it.
The last one right next to the Elks, and just before Ocean Avenue and the beach. And that the Mottola Post and Beachmont came in about the 1960s. 1970s.
Could you elaborate a little on the one on Shirley Avenue, because I never noticed it, and
Well, the one that was the most active at the time,
Oh.
and they had the best connection, and they were great lobbyists, and they got a lot of benefits for the veterans and everything else. And that, as I say, if you wanted to be commander down there, you had to be active, and you had to be an associate of Joe Hankin. They built that organization as well as the Legion. The Legion, when they were trying to raise money, had a Beano on Broadway Revere over where Dino's is today.
Yep.
Very small. And the VFW had theirs on Shirley Avenue in their clubhouse upstairs as well. And that's how they supported the organization.
When did the 940 go out of Shirley Avenue? Do you remember on that?
Yeah, they went out of it maybe about 15, 20 years ago. It was lack of membership, and that the Beachmont Post took in Winthrop veterans and East Boston. Matola Post had more or less a Ward 3, Ward 5 membership for a neighborhood clubhouse and things of that type. And that's
Very
what
good.
it was.
And I would like to say this before we continue, Tom. We all got to thank Revere TV8, because this is our 100th show. And let me tell you, it started out with one show every 2 weeks, and we've only been out about a year, a little over a year, and it's an honor to even have you come on and do our 100th
Let me tell you
show.
something. We were honored to have you. The Legion, when they started, was in an upstairs office across from the City Hall over the market. And that they built their clubhouse. They started in 1930. That's where the old police station used to be.
Right.
And they built it in 1936. And in 1943, during the war, they lost it. They built it for $44,000 and lost it for $14,000. And Mayor Carey at the time said, "Not on my watch." He bought it for the city and gave it back to the Legion. People don't know, but there's a state law and statute that says that any nationally organization that remembers the veterans, decorate their graves, and takes care of them, that the city or town has to provide them with quarters and help, which the city did. They moved their Veterans Affairs office to the Legion building to give the Revere a placement in the building, and upstairs became the Legion. And that...
You know, we are lucky, and I got to say this, Tom, we are lucky to have our mayor, Dan Rizzo, who's also a veteran.
He's a 6-year veteran, Navy veteran.
Right, and he does so much to help the veterans of the city of Revere.
Does, right.
So, Mr. Mayor, from all of us, from all our veterans, thank you. And especially for my friend here on my left, Tom Hill. Tom, before we went on the air, we were talking about different wars, and I guessed wrong, but you corrected me, which was good. That there was only 180 people.
180 people lost their lives from the city of Revere in the 5 wars we've been in since World War I. We lost 31 in World War I. We lost 122 in World War II, and 6 families had a double loss. Korean War, we lost 10. Vietnam War, we lost 12. And the Gulf War, which we ended now, was 5, for a total of 180. And that...
Did you know any of these people that were killed during the wartime?
Knew most of them in World War II.
Yep, I mean...
My mother knew each and every one of them. They all banded together. They all wrote together. They went to conventions together. And that they had a great bond, really. And that some of them had probably never get out of the house until they had that Gold Star Mothers meeting. I come from a small class at Immaculate. I come from a class of 39. I lost 4 in that class in World War II. And they all had an initial H. We had Dave Hardigan, he was a Marine, lost his life at Iwo Jima. We had Dave Hardigan. We had Jack Hannigan, got killed in a plane crash. We had Joe Harrington get on a Navy ship, and my brother Bert on an aircraft.
Tommy, that's 180 lives too much that we lose.
That's true.
That we lose. And I didn't know any of them, so I want to thank them for their sacrifice. And I salute each and every one of them, and may they rest in peace.
If you want to go back to the Legion and go back in the end of World War II, the president appointed a panel. And the panel, I think it was appointed by Truman, President Truman. And the panel consisted of John Stell, who came, represented the American Legion. I think he was a national commander. He came from Ohio, Brazil, Ohio. And he's the one that gave us the 5220 Club, the education benefits, which depended upon your length of service, and the GI Home program. The 5220 Club was the veterans. We were all getting out about the same time, had no employment. If you weren't employed and you didn't have a job, you got $20 a week for 52 weeks. If you went to work, you got nothing or was deducted from the $20. You'd go to the Social Security office. They had a separate line for the veterans, and they would go through the line and give them your story, and you'd get the money. The education benefits, you applied, went to a college, and then they accepted, and that the GI Home was a limit of, it was a guarantee. It was no money by the government, but they were your co-signers. And what it was that if you wanted to buy a house, they would give, I think it was 50% of the benefits you got from World War II up to a total of $25,000. So if you were buying a house for $9,000, the government would guarantee 50% of that in case of a default. In the event of a default, the bank would have to notify the VA 3 months after you were in default, and they would send a person out to see what the problem was, and if you could make your next payment and pay a little bit on your arrearage, then they would hold off the foreclosure. If they couldn't, then it would go back to the bank, and the VA would say, okay, foreclose, and that would take probably another 6 or 7 months, and the bank would have to foreclose, evict you, and would come back to the VA. The VA then had a property management section which took over the house. Now, if they sold the house, they would have an appraisal on the date of foreclosure, establishing a value. If you owed, say, $8,000 and they sold it for $6,000, the $2,000 that they would lose on the house would be their fault, not yours.
Oh, I see.
If you decreased the value, the government would come back after you if you had a pension check or a Social Security check and deduct it from it. And that if you had to relocate and had get rid of the property and the guarantee, and you had a remainder left on the guarantee, they would let you use that to the purchase of another house.
Tom,
And that's how they
I want to change the subject, if I may, sir. You are a veteran of the Pacific,
That's
of the
true.
U.S. Army Air Corps.
right.
Was that on an aircraft carrier?
No.
Okay.
No.
Would you tell us about your Pacific adventure during the war? Because I'm interested in that, and I'm sure a lot of people are too.
Okay, the Army Air Corps used it in Europe, and the casualties were quite high.
Very high.
So that they were 68%. So that they also included it in the Pacific. We would go with the Army Air Corps on the strip. We would tie up with the PT boats, but we were also Army Air Corps, members of the Army Air Corps. Now, if a plane went out on a strike, and it depended upon the amount of planes that they had, they would send out 15 planes. We would go out with them, and it depended upon the range of the boat. We had 43 boats in the squadron, 228 men made up the units. We had an 85-foot boat, which had a 13-man crew. We had a 63-foot boat had a 7-man crew, and we had a 45-foot boat, which had a 4-man crew, and we had a 24-foot boat, which had 4-man crew.
How do you remember?
Well, and that I was mostly on a 45-foot boat, which we had a range of about 4 hours out, 280 gallons of gas. A lot of times that when we pick up people, if a plane was down, it didn't stay up very long. If a plane went down, if it depended upon the fuel you had in your tanks, and it would stay afloat maybe a minute and a half to 5 minutes. A lot of times if it crashed in the jungles, the natives would bury the bodies. You'd have to have an undertaker with the shelter half take them, rebury the bodies, take them back, and bury them again. And that's the way it was. That was our service. I was a radio operator, and I had 7 receivers and 7 transmitters. I went to school in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for 18 weeks. I went to school midnight to 8 a.m. in the morning. We had a breakfast at 12:18 in the morning, had breakfast at 5:20, got through at 8 o'clock, and had calisthenics for from 8 to 10 a.m. in the morning.
What base was that at? If I may?
Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Sioux Falls, South Dakota was 41,000 people, was the largest city in 7 northwestern states, and that we had 20,000 on the base there, and that we were only allowed in town 1 day a week. There I met Joe Foss. Joe Foss was a Marine pilot.
Right.
He was a Medal of Honor winner, and that he was a truck driver. He became a congressman, United States Senator, and head of the American Football League. And that we gave him a parade there. One night when I met him, I was going in a restaurant, he was coming out, and he didn't have his hat on, and he said, "Have a good time, boys." And he said, "Don't be in any hurry to get over there. Not easy." And he was credited with shooting down 65 planes.
Tom?
26 planes, I'm sorry.
Tom, we got a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to wrap it up, but what I would like you to do is speak about whatever we missed. Forget about the 2 minutes, what I said.
Okay.
Take as much time as you need.
Okay, well.
Because you are a veteran.
No, you know.
And this is our 100th show, by the way.
Well, you ought to be congratulated for that.
No, it's a pleasure
Really.
to have you come on and make it the 100th show.
Okay. Let's see, we talked about the veterans.
Before you continue, I want to say, when you're 100 years old, we have a gentleman at the Senior Center. His name is Sal Santoro.
Yeah, Salvi.
Yep, he's
Yeah.
going to be 100 years old February
God
the 4th.
bless him. Yeah.
I try to get him on the show. It's hard. When you're around 100 years old, you'll be on many more times before that, I hope. But when you are 100 years old, we'll book you again.
I forgot to tell you, the Veterans Administration didn't come into effect until 1930. The veterans' benefits, they had none after World War I. It was all handled by the Soldiers' Home. And the Soldiers' Home, we were the first in the country. Other states followed, and then about 1960, they established another Soldiers' Home in Clinton, Mass., and the director of that went on to become state commander of the American Legion and national commander.
What was his name, you remember?
No, I don't remember it, to be honest.
all
But
right.
they abolished that Clinton in some ways 10 years ago or so. And that John Quigley was the head of the Soldiers' Home here, and he was great to the veterans. And any time you called him for a benefit or something, he was there. And he said to me one time, you know, he said, "You give me a pain in the can." He said, "Because you're always asking, and when I'm looking to increase the budget, where are you?" And he was right. And we were there after that. We put through a motion, let's help John Quigley. So that's about, you know, all I got to say and all I can remember.
That's good. So, Tom,
so-
let me thank you for coming on
Thank
the
you,
show.
Morris.
Let
Thank
me
you.
salute you first of all for your service. No, because you are a combatant veteran. I wasn't. So, I mean, you know, you put your life really on the line. I was behind the line.
I made all of the Pacific. I made the Philippines. I made Okinawa, Ishima, and I ended up at the Army of Occupations in Japan.
I did with the Army of Occupation in Germany.
You know what it was there.
Yep.
And that,
Tom, I got to tell you, it's a pleasure really to have taken the
pleasure,
time.
Morris, to be here.
No, I mean for you to take the time out to come up and
Oh,
do the show with us and to give us a little history, because you are full of history. And before I say anything else, I would like you, if you have the time, did you ever think about writing your memoirs in a book and everything that you know? It would be beautiful. And it would be the city of Revere, a history of the city of Revere, a history of our veterans.
Well, Carol Tye is going to program it. It's pretty good. And you know, a lot of things that came up, like with Carol Tye, like we had a 5 and 10 on Broadway. We had 5 newspapers in Revere, people don't remember. And then you had shoe cobblers, you had barber shops, and things of that type. You had the Dublin was halfway up Broadway. Tannen, the florist, is the only one that got a building permit during the 6 years of Casassa's Depression years and everything else. People hated Casassa because he was the mayor during the Depression, and they didn't have anything, and that they took it kind of out on the mayor. And that when you ask somebody, you know, do you know where Andy Casassa lived? They don't know. You know where he lived? Over the post office on the corner of Beach Street and North Shore Road. Then he moved to the Pines, and that they had a lot of clubs in Revere, the Orioles, the Elks, the Doyle Club, and that we used to have softball games on Broadway or at the stadium that had 800 people on an evening or something. They had nothing to do.
Okay, Tom. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you, Morris.
God bless the people of Revere.
Thank you very much.
The city of Revere, but most of all, God bless our
I'm
great
proud of
country,
Revere, and I love
the
Revere.
United States of America. And
Okay.
thank you, Tom.
Thank you.